When a man like Quentin Tarantino stops talking about movies and starts talking about real life, you don't just listen, you brace yourself. Because Tarantino doesn't do condolences. He doesn't do carefully worded statements. He doesn't do Hollywood funerals wrapped in soft lighting and polite lies. He does truth, raw, unfiltered. The kind of truth that publicists spend decades and millions of dollars trying to keep buried. And this time, he aimed it straight at one of Hollywood's most untouchable myths. While the media rushed to print glowing obituaries for Rob Reiner, painting him once again as the gentle giant behind comfort classics, the perfect liberal icon, the man who made America feel safe in movie theaters, Tarantino did something different. He pulled the curtain back. This wasn't a planned interview. There was no stage, no microphones, no agenda. It was raw audio captured during what was supposed to be a quiet conversation about film preservation. But like everything in Los Angeles that week, the conversation drifted. It drifted toward the news that had sucked the oxygen out of the city, toward the tragedy in Brentwood that didn't look like a peaceful ending, but like something ripped straight out of a psychological thriller. And what Tarantino said next changed everything. He didn't talk about Rob Reiner, the filmmaker. He didn't talk about Rob Reiner, the legend. He talked about Rob Reiner, the enabler. He described the Reiner family not as victims of a sudden, unpredictable storm, but as the architects of a slow-motion car crash that everyone inside the industry saw coming for years. Decades even. That's what made his words so terrifying. Because according to Tarantino, the real shock wasn't that this tragedy happened. The shock was that it took this long. Most people scrolling through headlines saw the same thing. A beloved director, a horrifying crime scene, a son arrested. And the same confused question echoed everywhere. How does the man who gave us comfort movies, who defined warmth and humanity on screen, end up as the centerpiece of a crime scene that looks like it belongs in a David Fincher film? Tarantino's answer was brutal. This wasn't random. This wasn't sudden. This wasn't fate. This was inevitable. And with that single word, he shattered the version of the story Hollywood desperately wants you to believe. Because once you hear Tarantino talk, once you understand what he's really accusing the industry of, you realize this isn't just about Rob Reiner. It's about a culture that watched a disaster unfold in real time and chose silence. According to Quentin Tarantino, the problem didn't start with violence. It started with privilege. He spoke about something the mainstream media is far too polite to touch. The world of Hollywood royalty families, houses where money is infinite, access is unlimited, and consequences simply don't exist. Places where children are given everything except boundaries. Tarantino knows this world intimately. He's been inside those living rooms. He sat at those dinner tables. He's watched kids grow up surrounded by power, protected by silence, shielded from reality. And he made one thing painfully clear. In those families, support often looks a lot like a slow-motion destruction. That's when he brought up Nick Reiner, not to humiliate him, not to mock him, but to indict the culture that created him. Tarantino reminded listeners that this wasn't some hidden struggle no one could have seen coming. The history was there, open, known, talked about in whispers at parties, inside conversations between agents and producers, always followed by the same sentence. Someone should really do something. But no one ever did. And then came the moment Tarantino said changed everything in his mind. The movie being Charlie. On paper, it looked noble. A father directing a film written by his own son, a story about addiction, recovery, and healing. The press loved it. Critics framed it as brave, honest, cathartic. But Tarantino saw something else entirely. In the leaked audio, he called it the most dangerous thing a father could have done, because by turning Nick's addiction into a screenplay, by packaging his trauma for festivals and red carpets, Rob Reiner didn't draw a line between real life and art. He erased it. Tarantino argued that the film didn't confront the chaos. It validated it. It taught Nick that his darkest moments weren't problems to be solved. They were material. They were compelling. They were proof that he was interesting, a tortured artist, a character worth watching. And that's where the story took a darker turn, because once trauma becomes content, once pain becomes applause, something inside a person breaks. Reality starts to feel less important than the performance. Consequences start to feel optional. Tarantino didn't speculate from the outside. He spoke as someone who had been there. He described industry events in Brentwood years earlier. Nick showing up looking hollow, unstable, clearly using, and the reaction from the room wasn't concern. It was applause. People shook his hand. They praised his writing. They told him he was brilliant. No one stopped him. No one stopped his father. No one said the words that mattered most. Your son is dangerous. Instead, the machine kept running. Because in Hollywood, stopping the machine is worse than watching it destroy someone. And that, Tarantino said, is how tragedy becomes inevitable. Tarantino's voice in that raw audio didn't sound like gossip. It sounded like disgust. Because once he laid out the pattern, the story stopped being about one tragic night in the Brentwood and became about a choice that repeated itself for years. He talked about Rob Reiner as a man trapped by his own persona, the same nice guy image the public adored, the gentle giant, the humane director, the man who always understood emotion on a screen. And yet, according to Tarantino, Rob allegedly couldn't do the one thing that real life demanded. He couldn't drop the hammer. Tarantino described a father who kept believing he could direct his way out of a family crisis, like he was building a third act twist. Like if he just listened harder, gave more support, and offered one more lifeline, the script would flip and everyone would go home safely. But real life doesn't follow a screenplay. And that's where Tarantino delivered one of the most chilling ideas in the entire conversation. He called it terminal empathy, a kind of compassion that doesn't heal. It doesn't rescue. It doesn't even comfort. It kills. Because it keeps the danger close, not out of evil, but out of hope. Then Tarantino went where most people refuse to go, the money and the access, the parts that turn a personal tragedy into an industry indictment. He said, yes, Rob loved his son. Nobody doubts that. But love isn't the same as protection. And in Tarantino's mind, the proof was simple. Nick still had access, despite volatility, despite instability. Despite a long history of unpredictable behavior, Nick remained in that orbit, close enough to touch the house, close enough to touch the life, close enough to stay inside the kingdom. Tarantino's implication was brutal. In the real world, if someone is a danger to you, you change the locks. You create distance. You do the heartbreaking thing because you want to survive. But in Hollywood, he said, families often do the opposite. They build a guest house. They hire private help. They manage the madness quietly, not because they're heartless, because they're terrified of a scandal, terrified of admitting the truth out loud that the child they love may be beyond saving, that their legacy might come with rot in the walls. So instead of consequences, the troubled child gets cushions. The fall gets softened every time, and eventually the person falling stops being afraid of the impact. Tarantino painted it like a sick equation. Every time Nick fell, Rob put a pillow down. Eventually, Nick stopped caring if he fell. He stopped caring who he landed on. And what made it worse, Tarantino hinted, was that this wasn't a secret inside the inner circle. People had seen it. He talked about industry events, the kind that look glamorous from the outside and feel cold on the inside. Nick drifting through rooms like a ghost, unstable, and the people around him acting like nothing was wrong. Agents, producers, friends, smiling through it, pretending it was normal, because in this world, acknowledging the truth is considered ruder than letting the truth destroy someone. That's what Tarantino was really furious about. Not just one son, not just one father, but an entire town trained to look away. And as he kept talking, the story slid closer to the timeline, closer to the weeks before the tragedy, closer to the quiet escalation that nobody wanted to name, because if Tarantino was right, then this wasn't a sudden snap. It was a slow grind. And the most terrifying part, everyone knew the ending was coming. Tarantino didn't just speak in philosophy, he hinted at a timeline, and the way he said it made it feel like everyone inside the bubble had been holding their breath for weeks, waiting for something they were too afraid to name. He pointed toward a stretch of time leading up to the tragedy, the part the police reports can list in cold sentences, but can't explain in human language. Not the what, but the slow build of the why. He mentioned the silence around the house, the feeling that something had shifted, that the atmosphere had turned heavy, not dramatic in a tabloid way, but in the way a home feels when people stop laughing, stop inviting friends over, stop opening curtains. Then he brought up the rumors. He didn't present them as wild gossip. He treated them like smoke. And where there's a smoke in Brentwood, it usually means someone is desperately trying to keep a fire from being seen. Tarantino said there were whispers that things escalated around Thanksgiving, the kind of whispers that barely hit the tabloids because the system is designed to prevent that. Not just to protect reputations, but to protect an entire mythology. And then he hinted at something even more disturbing, a confrontation. Not in the house, not in private, at a screening. He described it like an incident that should have blown up, but didn't, because publicists allegedly smothered it quickly, wrapped it in silence, and pushed it back into the shadows where Hollywood stores its inconvenient truths. According to Tarantino's take, the confrontation wasn't just emotional, it was about power. Nick, he said, wasn't only making demands for money, he was making demands for control. Control over projects, control over decisions, control over his own narrative. And behind those demands, Tarantino sensed resentment, a deep, rotting resentment that had been building for years, because the recovery narrative that once made Nick look like a tragic artist didn't last. And when the applause fades, when the spotlight moves on, the person who's been living inside that narrative doesn't just feel lost, they feel humiliated. Tarantino's analysis was sharp. Nick was trapped in a shadow he couldn't escape. The addict, a son of a legend. The boy everyone patted on the head and called brave until they got tired of the story. And once the story stopped being profitable, he was left with nothing but the anger. But here's where Tarantino drew the line between a normal parent and a Hollywood parent. A normal person, he implied, would see this kind of escalation and think, this is dangerous. But Rob Reiner, in Tarantino's telling, didn't see a threat. He saw a struggling boy, a character who needed development, a story that could still be fixed. So instead of cutting him off, instead of creating distance, Rob pulled him closer. The way you pull in someone you're terrified to lose, the way you cling to hope because the alternative is too ugly to admit. And that is what Tarantino called the industry's taboo, not the addiction, not the privilege, not even the volatility. The taboo was fear. The idea that behind those gates, behind the donations, behind the perfect political image and the soft reputation, the family wasn't just struggling with Nick. They were allegedly terrified of him. And that fear, Tarantino suggested, was the secret they never wanted to speak aloud. Because once you admit you fear your own child, the myth collapses. The myth of the perfect family, the myth of control, the myth that money and love can solve anything. And if that myth collapses, then suddenly the whole town has to ask itself a question it can't handle. How many other families are sitting in mansions tonight, quietly afraid, pretending everything is fine? Tarantino shifted the focus in a way most people never do. Because in stories like this, the public usually locks onto two figures, the famous father and the troubled son. Everyone else becomes background, collateral, a footnote, but Tarantino didn't let that happen. He brought up Michelle Singer Reiner, and the way he spoke her name carried something heavy, not just sympathy, something closer to dread. He suggested that for years, Michelle was the invisible structure holding the entire household together. The buffer, the person standing between Rob's optimism and Nick's reality. Rob, in Tarantino's telling, wanted to believe. He wanted to see hope, redemption, growth. He wanted to keep the story moving toward a happy ending. Michelle had to live in the day-to-day, the chaos, the mood swings, the tension in the walls, the fear that doesn't look like fear until it's too late. Tarantino implied she wasn't just supporting her husband, she was managing the madness, containing it, doing what countless spouses in powerful homes do quietly, making sure the world never sees what happens behind the gate. And then he said something that felt like a knife sliding under the skin of the story. He suggested that Michelle helped keep a secret buried. Not the secret of a struggle, but the secret of terror. There's a difference, Tarantino implied, between having a child who is sick and having a child you're afraid of. You can admit sickness, that's socially acceptable. Rehab stories are Hollywood-friendly. They can be turned into a narrative, a redemption arc. But fear makes you look like a failure. Fear makes you look like you lost control. Fear makes you look like the perfect family was never perfect. So you don't admit it. You swallow it. You lock the doors at night. You pretend in the morning. You keep smiling at fundraisers and you pray the dam holds. Tarantino's voice, as he described this, sounded almost haunted. Like he wasn't just talking about the Rainers anymore, but about a pattern he's seen all over Los Angeles. And then he reached the turning point because buffers don't last forever. Eventually, the person holding the wall together gets exhausted, the body breaks down, the mind says, I can't do this anymore. And when that buffer wears thin, the entire system collapses. That's the image Tarantino painted. a dam holding back water for years, cracks forming, everyone seeing them, everyone pretending the cracks aren't there, until one day the wall doesn't crack. It explodes. And suddenly, what was contained becomes uncontrollable. What was whispered becomes headlines. What was hidden behind expensive art and polite smiles becomes a crime scene. Tarantino didn't give graphic details. He didn't glorify anything, but he pointed to one detail that made the story feel like pure horror, not because it was sensational, but because it was intimate. He pointed to the lack of forced entry. That one fact changes everything because it means this wasn't a stranger. It wasn't an intruder. It wasn't some random nightmare from outside the gate. It was someone who knew the alarm code, someone who knew the house, someone who knew which floorboards creaked, someone who knew where people sat at night. And that intimacy Tarantino implied is what turns this from scandal into tragedy, a Greek tragedy, the kind where the hero isn't destroyed by an enemy, but by his own bloodline. This is where Tarantino stopped sounding like a filmmaker and started sounding like a man who had finally run out of patience. Because once he described the lack of forced entry, once he framed the horror as something that came from inside the family, he made a choice. He refused to call it a scandal. He refused to call it unthinkable. He refused to call it a shocking twist. Instead, he used a word that landed like a verdict, inevitability. And then he said the line that people can't stop repeating because it feels too harsh to be true and too true to ignore. You feed a tiger in your living room for years. You don't get to be surprised when it decides you look like prey. It's brutal. It feels almost cruel, but Tarantino didn't say it to be edgy. He said it like an accusation aimed at an entire culture. Because to him, this wasn't only about one father and one son. It was about a town that mistakes silence for kindness. A town where everyone watches problems spiral. But no one wants to be the person who says the ugly truth out loud. And that's where Tarantino's anger sharpened into something bigger. He pointed to accountability, not only Nick's accountability for what happened, but the accountability of the people who saw the slow-motion disaster and kept clapping. He brought up the kind of details police reports will list without emotion, without context, details that sound normal on paper until you picture them as real human life. How many people worked on being Charlie and saw Nick struggling? How many people were around him, shook his hand, praised him, and pretended they didn't see what they were seeing? How many people went to that house, fundraisers, gatherings, industry dinners, and noticed the damage that never got discussed? Tarantino implied the truth was uncomfortable. Everybody knew. And if everybody knew, then the silence wasn't just one family's silence, it was collective. It was the silence of a community that prefers a beautiful lie to an ugly truth. That's what Tarantino claimed he broke. Not because he wanted attention, but because he was disgusted by how quickly the narrative was being sanitized. Because even now, according to Tarantino, the machine is already trying to reshape the story into something more comfortable. A tragedy with no villains. A mental health story with soft edges. A cautionary tale where responsibility blurs into nobody's fault. But Tarantino didn't buy that. He pushed it back toward the uncomfortable reality. A person can suffer, a person can struggle, and still be responsible for what they choose to do. And just when you think his message is already explosive enough, he pivots to something even darker. He starts talking about what comes next. because in his mind, the tragedy wasn't the final chapter. The trial would be. This was the moment Tarantino's tone changed. Up until now, he had been dissecting the past, patterns, culture, silence. But when he started talking about what was coming next, his voice hardened because in his mind, the most disturbing chapter of the story hadn't even begun. The trial. Tarantino said something that sounded less like speculation and more like a prediction, one shaped by decades of watching how Hollywood, media, and high-profile courtrooms really work. Watch them turn Rob into the villain. That was the line. He wasn't guessing. He was warning. Tarantino explained that the legal defense was already visible if you knew where to look. He predicted, almost beat for beat, how Alan Jackson would frame the case once it reached the courtroom. The argument wouldn't just be about the act itself, it would be about pressure, legacy, psychological weight. They would argue that being the son of Rob Reiner was a prison, that the expectations, the comparisons, the shadow of greatness crushed Nick's mind until it fractured. And then, this is what made Tarantino furious, they would use Rob's kindness against him. They would call the enabling a form of psychological confinement. They would suggest that love became control, that protection became manipulation. In other words, they would put the dead man on trial. Tarantino didn't hide his disgust. You could hear it in the way his voice tightened, in the way he paused before finishing sentences. To him, it was a perversion of reality. A man who spent his life trying to be decent, to be humane, to be patient, dissected in court and partially blamed for his own death. He called it sick. But worse than that, he called it predictable. Because this is how high-profile murder trials work when fame is involved. The narrative gets flipped. Sympathy gets rerouted. Responsibility gets blurred until it feels abstract. And that's when Tarantino explained why he was speaking now. Why not George Clooney? Why not Steven Spielberg? Because they have too much to lose. They are part of the polite society. The dinner circuits, the charity galas, the quiet agreements not to say certain things out loud. Tarantino has always been different, an outsider on the inside, close enough to see the rot, detached enough to name it. He doesn't care about the next Vanity Fair party. He cares about the truth of human behavior. And to him, the Reiner situation wasn't just a family tragedy. It was the ultimate failure of the Hollywood dream. Because Rob Reiner wasn't supposed to end like this. He wasn't just a director. He was part of a dynasty. The son of Carl Reiner, a symbol of generational success done right. And for that myth to end in blood on the floor of a Brentwood mansion didn't just shock the industry, it shattered it. It told every celebrity something they never want to admit. No matter how many awards you win, no matter how much money you give away, no matter how good your intentions are, you're not safe from your own creations. And as Tarantino kept talking, the focus shifted one last time, away from the courtroom, away from the lawyers, toward the moment everyone keeps avoiding, the night itself. Tarantino didn't describe the night like tabloid entertainment. He treated it like a horror story that didn't need gore to be terrifying, because the terror wasn't in the details. It was in the intimacy. He pointed to what investigators reportedly noticed immediately, what the headlines mention almost casually, but what changes the emotional weight of the entire case. No forced entry. That means no stranger, no random intruder, no faceless villain from outside the gates. It means someone came in the way family comes in. someone who knew the code, someone who knew the rhythm of the house, someone who knew which floorboard betrayed you with a creak and which hallway stayed silent. Tarantino lingered on that idea like it made him physically sick, because it transforms a crime story into something older, something mythic, something almost unavoidable. He compared it to a Greek tragedy, not a scandal, not a celebrity meltdown, a tragedy where the hero is destroyed by his own bloodline. And when he said that, you could feel what he was really doing. He was refusing to let Hollywood reduce this into a clean headline, because clean headlines are comforting. Shocking incident, unexpected tragedy, sudden mental break. But Tarantino wouldn't allow the comfort. He kept insisting this wasn't sudden. It was a long grind, a slow motion collapse built over years of yes, years of softened consequences, years of people pretending not to see what they were seeing. And then he delivered another uncomfortable truth. He said, if we treat this as a simple tragedy, we miss the lesson. We miss the accountability. Not just Nick's accountability, but the accountability of everyone who watched the chaos unfold and never intervened. Because intervening would have been messy, impolite, and career-threatening. He made it visual in a way that cut deep. How many people worked around Nick and saw instability up close? How many people smiled anyway? How many people stepped into the Reiner home, fundraisers, gatherings, industry nights, and sensed the tension in the walls? How many people saw damage that had been covered up, not with repairs, but with expensive distractions? He suggested something chilling. Tarantino wasn't breaking his own silence. He was breaking a collective silence, a silence that belongs to a town that loves beautiful lies more than ugly truths. And as he said it, he tied it into the moment the whole industry is living through, this era where people can't stop talking about Nepo babies. Most of the public resentment, Tarantino implied, is superficial. People complain about unfair access to roles, to opportunities, to connections. But this case pushes the conversation into something darker. It's not just about privilege giving someone success, it's about privilege rotting someone from the inside. Nick had every advantage a human being could possibly have: the best schools, the best rehab options, the best connections. A father who even turned his struggle into a project the world could applaud. And the outcome was still destruction. Tarantino's takeaway was bleak. Struggle can build character, but total ease can build monsters. Because without consequences, a person never learns where the line is. And once the line stops existing, anything becomes possible. Then Tarantino dropped one more detail quietly, but with the weight of a ticking clock. A date that was already hanging over Los Angeles like a storm cloud. January 7th, a looming courtroom moment that in his mind would turn this from tragedy into a spectacle. And that's where he warned, the next phase of this story won't be about truth. It will be about narrative warfare. Tarantino didn't call it a trial, he called it an autopsy, because in his mind, what's coming isn't just about guilt or innocence, it's about cutting open the illusion Hollywood has spent a century protecting and letting everyone see what's been rotting inside. He said January 7th isn't just a court date, it's a reckoning, a moment when private texts get read aloud, when recorded voices lose their privacy, when a famous man's final words stop being movie dialogue and start becoming evidence. And that's why Tarantino spoke before the courtroom lights turn on. He believes the defense will try to turn the trial into a circus. Subpoenas, celebrity names, familiar faces dragged into testimony. not because they matter to the truth, but because the spectacle confuses accountability. He even floated the possibility quietly, almost bitterly, that people like himself could be pulled into it. Imagine that, he said. A filmmaker on the stand dissecting the parenting choices of another filmmaker under oath for public consumption. That's the future he sees. And that's why he wanted to lock something into the record now, that this wasn't society's fault. It wasn't fame's fault. It wasn't pressure's fault. It was the act of an individual who had been given every possible chance and chose violence. Tarantino was clear about one thing: empathy cannot erase responsibility. Context can explain behavior, but it cannot absolve it. And Hollywood, he warned, has a dangerous habit of confusing explanation with excuse. What makes this story so hard to look away from, what makes it feel bigger than celebrity gossip, is that it destroys the fantasy at the heart of the industry. We're trained to believe these people are untouchable, that money buys safety, that gates and guards and private lives create immunity. But this time, the call didn't come from outside the house. It came from inside, and that forces a question no one wants to ask out loud. If this can happen to one of Hollywood's most beloved families, what does that say about all the others pretending they're fine? Tarantino pointed to the quiet reactions of the surviving siblings, measured statements, composed silence, love instead of rage. He didn't criticize it, he understood it. To him, it looked like the final act of protection, one last attempt to hold up the image of a family that had already collapsed behind closed doors. And that's the final irony he couldn't shake. A man who made films about truth, about standing up to authority, about telling it like it is, dying because he couldn't face the truth in his own kitchen. As the trial approaches, Tarantino warned, things will get uglier. Photos will leak, narratives will twist, people will rush to sanitize, soften, and simplify what should never be simplified. So when the next headline hits, when the bold print screams for attention, he urged people to look past it, look for the silences, look for who isn't speaking, look for the families watching from behind gates, wondering if they are next. Because in Tarantino's view, this story was never really about a murder. It was about a myth. And that myth, the perfect Hollywood family, the idea that success protects you from consequence, died the same night the illusion finally ran out of places to hide. This wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of Hollywood examining its own body on the table and not liking what it finds,